I'm Ann Stoller. Those of you who don't know me, the director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry, and it's really with great pleasure that I get to introduce for our second public lecture in this year's Institute series by Professor Nilüfer Göle, who is convening fellows from around the world for her ICSI masterclass on Euroislam, and who will be speaking to us this evening about Islam in the unmaking, sort of making, unmaking, right, of a European public square. I really know of no one who has so consistently and persistently asked a very broad us to consider what Islam is and the changing forms in which it is portrayed, who gets to speak, and who gets heard in the public domain. Having known Nilüfer since we were both fledgling doctoral students in the early 1980s, right? Well, you weren't even born, I know. Writing our dissertations, or rather not writing them, in the library of la Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris, there is no surprise, but there is awe in where she has come. Since her earliest forays into the relationship between being Muslim and being modern, to her striking new studies of ordinary Muslims in the conflictual cultural and political spaces of a contested Europe, she's not only pushed on the boundaries of political discourse, but offered, I think, a new vocabulary with which to think it as she has sought to redefine its terms and still be heard. Trained as a sociologist at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, a sojourner between Turkey, Istanbul, where she was born, and Paris, where she has predominantly lived, Nilüfer Göle sets a standard, I think, for what it means to be a public intellectual. Not cloistered, not protected by the academy. I mean, impossible in the subjects she deals with, right? Willing to take unpopular positions, and she definitely has. Willing to speak across the hardened boundaries that certain forms of secularism and religion demand, inviting all those who can hear her and hear what she has to say to ourselves emerge, if only incrementally, more fully into a more complex and nuanced understanding of the sheer diversity of being Muslim, and being, but not appearing so, of being visible in different ways, of new precarities that threaten to ravage the hopes for a conjoined public space. Nilüfer's feminist politics inform the questions she asks and of whom she asks them. From her first book, The Forbidden Modern, published in 1996, to the spate of new books that have appeared in English over the last few years, Islam in Europe, and most recently, The Daily Lives of Muslims, there's a joining of a conceptual care, an empirical rigor, and a unique sociological imagination that brings her to ask, what is the reality faced by Muslims today? I think that's one of the really basic questions. What is that reality? Who are they? And what do they have to do? And what are they being asked to do and refusing to do as fully modern subjects? This study of ordinary Muslims in Europe, the first of its kind, carried out over 4 or 5 years, because it's a 5-year fellowship, but it's 4 years of actual work with Muslims and non-Muslims. It's really important. Takes as its key conceptual and methodological point of entry, not abstract questions about the veil, but grounded events. I really like that focus on grounded events and confrontations, attentive to events that touch, taint, animate, and constrain daily lives. And looking to Islam and its public confrontations in Europe, which is actually the subtitle of her last book, she attends, as she puts it, to how each controversial event created a public field, made different actors appear, mobilized a certain rhetoric, and deployed a particular repertoire of actions. I think that's a really lovely formulation. how these affairs of the veil, of eating halal, of a new minaret, have unfolded in real time and place are what defines her venture. With urgency and insistent questioning, and refusing to set aside the really uncomfortable questions, she makes them ours as well. So join me in welcoming her this evening.
Thank you very much. And I think maybe one of the most important privileges of seeing time passing by is sustainable friendship. And feminism is also this, how you are empowered by a woman colleague. And that's, I really would like to express my gratitude to Anne Stoller. I don't think this could have happened in previous generations, how she creates a space here, this Institute for Critical Social Inquiry, a space for freedom of thought, and for me to come and meet with wonderful students and colleagues. And she has set already the frame in the opening talk for this program, saying it should be grounded inquiry, grounded research with theory, with not capital T, but little t, and I really follow that lesson. So I really express my thanks to her. And yesterday's talk, I would like to also come to Richard Bernstein's talk, because I felt very much protected almost with this talk, because he set the tune, and I feel I am following his footsteps, and I hope I'm not making any injustice to his approach of Hannah Arendt, and in what are the ways I find bridges between his talk and mine is first the incident of living experience, as Anne said, grounded work, empirical work. The incident of lived experience has to have an impact on our ways of thinking. And I think Islam is an incident of living experience in Europe. And we still don't know what kind of ways of thinking we should relate ourselves with Islam in the European public space. And public space is the main realm in which I'm trying to understand this confrontational encounter between Muslims and, let's say, native Europeans, how to put it. So let me start with a quotation. This is the only quotation. The other part of my paper will not be read, but it will be a kind of conversation, so please don't be so exigent with my English or my phrases. So I'll try to communicate my way of thinking. The quote I will take from Orhan Pamuk, novelist, Turkish novelist, and a friend, from a chapter which is the title of the chapter is No Entry, and I think it is exactly the issues that we are dealing with. The inscription, No Entry, in French, Entrée interdite, it's even more powerful, forbidden entry. The inscription No Entry is there to remind some that they are allowed to enter and others that they are not. The message that they wish to share is probably the following. Not all may enter here. Behind the banner, we hear the voices of those who fear being invaded by these new arrivals. Too many people from outside are coming in, they say. We cannot accept everyone. People on the inside want to protect their privileges, their material goods, their tastes, their habits, ways of life. I think Orhan Pamuk's text very allegorically describes the general mood in European countries today. The structuring effect the stranger, the migrant, the refugees has on European identity. I think we are far away from the emblematic figure of the flaneur, of this emblematic figure of Western modernity since Baudelaire and Benjamin Flaneur, and today it is the migrant, but very different from the flaneur. The mobility and the mobility is totally questioned And there is this will for reinforcement of boundaries, many boundaries, geographical, cultural, interior frontiers. So the historical context in which we are speaking today, I will try to make this macro subject, Islam, European public sphere, very, at the end, I hope, will be much more micro level sociological practices, grounded. It will become more understandable. The historical moment that we are speaking in is, we can speak of politics of enmity, definition of us and them. We observe everywhere in every European country the rise of right-wing movements. We don't know how to name them exactly because we see that it is not only right-wing, but also mainstream, neo-populist, but at least three features are common to all these movements. One is the disenchantment with the idea of Europe. So some people now are trying to create some enchantment with the idea of Europe, but this Eurosceptics. Second one is nativist nationalism. Nationalism could have had some aspects of universal, but here we see nativist nationalism. And third is Islamophobia. I would not use the word again, but this time I will use, because the agendas were changed in these movements because they have put in at the center of their agenda Islam. It was not only about xenophobia. It is not the old racist forms of the previous generation of right wing, but basically Islam is becoming the main target in their politics. Just to give one example, the difference between the father, Le Pen, and the daughter, Marine Le Pen, is exactly the relationship to system. Father was anti-system, and xenophobe, racist, homophobe, and anti-Semite. The daughter tries to be part of the Republican secular feminist discourse, not anti-Semite, but she made her entry being against the public prayer of Islam in Paris and making the connection, analogy with the occupation of Nazis and public prayer in the streets. So just to give one example, one snapshot to make this story very short, that the new neo-populist movements are reshaped by their relations to Islam. But as I say, this is not only in relation to these right movements, because they join the general public mainstream positions and fears in relation to Islam. There are three, I would say, very different problems that are thought to be together today in relation to European countries, in relation to Islam. One is the refugee crisis, and this is related with Islam, refugee crisis coming from many other countries, and that has a very important effect on Europe. Europe as a fortress, no entry, we should protect Europe. Second one is global terrorist jihadist movements, and this brings also the politics of security, securitization politics everywhere. Again, to name it, in the case of Britain, programs to prevent, in the case of France today, de-radicalization of Muslims. There's a big debate. Is this about religion becoming more radical, or violence has nothing to do with religion, but it provides a kind of rhetoric. Third is all the controversies in relation to Islamic presence in the public life. The third one is my subject. We cannot think of refugee crisis, terrorist acts, and ordinary Muslims together. So I speak of ordinary Muslims. I tried to find out the way to speak about Muslims. They are so different, it's so heterogeneous. I was telling to my students, I had to give up my sociological urge to make classifications. You cannot classify them. You can make literature. How to take into consideration singularity of Muslims. They are coming from very different ethnical origins, different countries, different moments of historical push factors from their countries, and they are hosted in different countries. They have very different relations to faith, to Islamic religion, confessional differences. It's a totally heterogeneous category. How to name it? Muslims is this general category, but it helps. Why it helps? Because it shows us that we are at a moment of history that I will consider as post-migration. We cannot understand them in relation to migration. When you speak of them as coming from migration, migrant origins, there's a huge criticism. They would say, we don't want to be defined in relation to the roots, belongings of our parents. We are not Algerians, we are French. We are living in France, but we are Muslims. Muslim became a more universal category. So this kind of redefining their faith, Islam, not in the way their fathers or mothers would have defined, but in the European context. That, I think, this is the first thing we should be aware of it. That is, Islam is taking a new shape in Europe, European features of Islam, and it raises new questions because of this practice. First one is, it is not a kind of process that is transmitted in the family in a natural environment. The conditions of migration created a kind of rupture in terms of the continuity of the chains of transmission. So the religion is not something that you bring the Quran in your suitcase and then you are Muslim on your identity card. It has to be relearned. And this is, first of all, one thing very important for European Muslims. They are relearning in a much more knowledgeable way their religion. They have to acquire it outside the family, outside the neighborhood, because mosques are not there in proximity. So this is one feature already. And ordinary Muslims, it's almost like an oxymoron. It's oxymoron. You can't be ordinary and Muslim at the same time. If you're an ordinary citizen, you are not visible. If you are Muslim, that means you're not giving up. You are not erasing your religious difference. So it creates a tension. So this is why I called it ordinary Muslims, just to underline that these Muslims are living, they want to pursue in their daily lives their faith. And that creates a series of problems. That's why the public life is very important, public life more than public space, because they bring their religion into public life. It becomes visible in the public life. And that creates a series of controversies that I want to deal with. What disturbs? So this hyphen, let's say, between being European and Muslim, French and Muslim, is not easily established. It's not a linear process. It creates a problem. What makes this process so difficult, we can ask? Why it is not so easy to be in an inclusionary, pluralistic public sphere? What is lacking in framing difference? Is it the category of race which will help us to understand why this is so difficult? Etienne Balibar would argue that there is this sedimentation of the past in the present to understand this racial hatred against Muslims today, which is reproduced in a way by anti-Semitism. So it says there's the reproduction of anti-Semitism, he would say, against Arabo migrants. He never uses the word Muslim. Arabo, French especially, Arabo migrants. So is category of racism will be helpful for us to understand this difficulty of being accepted for Muslims? He would call Balibar race without racism. This is the neo-race situation. And Tarek Modoud also would speak for British Muslims of cultural racism to understand the difficulty. Eric Fassin, I think, will speak about racialization of Islam. I think these are all very helpful in understanding how the sedimentation of the past comes back, and we understand the problems of discrimination in relation to foreigners, strangers, and today Muslims. But I think there is still something that cannot be totally captured by the category of race, and it is religion. Mostly, secular left is blind to religion. All our criticisms are thought in relation to race, which is a very important category. But today, the religion also, the presence of religion, addresses some issues to secular modernity that we cannot only grasp by the category of race. And here, of course, I follow Talal Assad's work, how power of secularity is also undermined by these manifestations of religion in the European public sphere. Coming back to what is public visibility of Islam. So because we have to start also with Muslim subjectivities. It is related with their faith practices. What disturbs, what makes this process so difficult is first, there's a question of boundaries. The European Western secularity presupposes that faith is something that is privatized, should be privatized. So bringing faith into the public sphere already creates a kind of transgressive effect. And as Sabah Mahmoud has shown, piety is something embodied. It is not only in our heads, it's not only a question of belief, it's an embodied practice. You cannot divide yourself between private and public. So it is by definition, when something is so personal and embodied practice, then it becomes, of course, in ordinary life, there is manifestation. When you put on the veil and you go outside, it's an embodied practice, and it becomes visible. And it is not only religious, it is also something culturally defining categories of modesty. So what are those Islamic prescriptions that create a problem? Because I think this was also something that questioned me. I said, Muslims are trying to be good Muslims in Europe. They are trying to have their ordinary lives and still follow some of the Islamic prescriptions. But when you go to the Islamic prescriptions, this is not all, the controversies are not all about Islamic prescriptions. Today there is fasting during Ramadan, but that never became a controversy. I shouldn't speak loud. This might become a controversy. You never know when controversies arise. Controversies has their own life. It suddenly arrives, an incident of lived experience, unexpected. There are some kind of visibility that create a problem. Some others, they do not. The word ostentatious is already bringing us conspicuous to these complexities of the social relationship. Because visibility is something also related with public perception. So what is in the eyes of the other conspicuous, disturbing, and what is not? That's why the word controversy is very important, because it is this interface, intercultural interface. There's Muslim subjectivity. They think they cover themselves. They just follow their faith. And then there's this public perception who would think this is not an assertive religiosity, but some kind of aggressiveness to the norms, common norms. So public space is a space of contentious, because there's never total right communication, something always lost in translation. But especially in multicultural contexts, I think this will be even more heightened, this difficulty of making adjustment between your own subjectivity and public perception. So the word ostentatious was a very important word when French tried to make a law. They made a law against the headscarf covering in the high schools, 2005. I think it was very telling about the visibility, because they said signs that are considered ostentatious. But this depends who you are. For a Muslim, headscarf is not ostentatious. It's something familiar. So there's something unfamiliarity, uncanny about the visibility of Islam that triggers these social anxieties. More than that, there is also the Islamic prescriptions that created most controversies is about covering of women. During these 4 years, I made a cluster of controversies, a kind of inquiry at the level of really media coverage, what are these controversies all over Europe. Mostly, cluster is around covering of women, praying in public and mosque constructions. They go together, but still I think we should differentiate them. Halal food, halal alimentation. There are many facets of this halal, because there's also ritual slaughtering behind that, not only dietary habits, and also mostly holding to the values of Islamic figures, sacredness of Islamic figures, that is, visual depictions of the Prophet, like, you know, the other controversies around cartoon controversy. So in each of these controversies, especially therefore 4 of them, almost all over Europe, they emerged in different places. They were mediatized, full coverage, and then some of them became global, some of them became European, and some of them totally stayed at the local, national level. What I have done in my research is to go to these places and to meet with real people around the controversy. So trying to save public space from media. Because I have realized that when we speak of controversies and public sphere, instantly people think of media. Media is more important than public sphere. So I had to make these experimental public spaces, gatherings around the controversies. That's just a glimpse of the research. So around these controversies, visibility means bringing faith into the public sphere, but public sphere including market, because halal food is market. But also there is this space element, which is very important. Space element is important for the visibility, because when the headscarf is carried by working class, first generation, this is not visible. Nobody mentioned the headscarf of the working class ladies. It became a controversy when the girls were attending high school. So there is a paradox here. So it's not the failure of integration, as people would say. On the contrary, when the integration started, there is a successful integration as far as these girls are going to schools. But they don't want to give up their religion. That creates the problem. So it's not failure of integration. It is when the process of integration starts, that's what I mean, post-migration. They are already becoming citizens. They are knowing the language, not like their mothers. They are closer to their French fellows in the class than to their mothers most of the time, and so on. So this spatial transgression is very important. They are coming to the centers of the society, center in the sense of shills, center and periphery. So instead of just being reserved to working class migrant zones, they transgress this place and they become visible. Visibility is, therefore, there is a space element. There's a space element also in Etienne Balibar would speak about the boomerang effect between the colony and the metropole. That is, it is no longer colonization, but the metropole is occupied by the colonized. So this has also a boomerang effect in the sense that there is this undesired proximity. I think the question of space and proximity is very important. Social proximity, but it's also showing social mobility of these migrants, becoming almost middle classes, and bringing it from periphery to the center. The mosque issue is a very important one. Praying rooms, it was never a problem for the working class. There's enough praying rooms in Europe. But when you want to construct a mosque at the center of the city, it becomes a public issue because all the inhabitants of the city would share it. It becomes a public issue. It concerns all, not only Muslims. And it becomes visible what kind of a mosque we want. Should it be only the mosque as it is in Morocco or in Turkey? Or can there be any form which will be a European form? So architectural shape matters. And these are all very important debates in making Islam European. So this one is spatial transgression from private to public, from margins to the center of the city. And secondly, it has a disruptive effect, this presence, on secular norms and belonging. These are unspoken norms. There's no law that has forbidden women coming to high school with a headscarf. They made the law afterwards. But there was a disruptive effect because it has broken away with the common sense, with the common sense of doxa, in the sense that this is how high schools should be. And this is not about French exceptionalism. Here I differ from John Scott. You can see it in every other country. The same reiteration of secular norms in relation to Islam. So there is something that disturbs, first, publicness of religion, second, secular norms of the public sphere. I just want to say a few words on Arendt, if you allow me. This is making yourself visible. This is, I think, one can understand this Islamic presence is this courage to bring your religion to the public sphere. You can only understand it when you compare it with the first generation. First generation is very discreet. They don't want to make their religion, faith, visible. Only second generation have the courage to show, to manifest their religious visibility. So Hannah Arendt would say it's an act of citizenship. You don't wait for citizenship first. The courage of making yourself visible in the public sphere is an act of citizenship. So what I mean, Muslims are becoming citizen, but very contentious citizen in Europe. And it is not visible minorities in the passive term, but active minorities. Active minority in the sense of, maybe you will remember Serge Moscovici from our young days in Paris. He has spoken about active minorities. It's not the numbers, your condition as a minority that determines, but you act upon it. And in a conscious way, you make it assertive. So there is this assertiveness of religion, which can be seen as a sort of negritude. Although the word Islamitude is not nice, I should have used it. That is the reversal of the stigma. Instead of getting rid of Islam as something backward, something that is not helping women to be emancipated, they are taking the stigma and reversing it because they are changing the signification of the veil as far as you go now into professional life. You are pursuing your desires for becoming a person. It's an active minority, but it is the same reversal of the stigmat as the negritude. So these controversies, just to give you a glimpse, are in many different places are taking, it's not only in France, I said, covering of women, it took place mostly in France. But praying and mosque construction, it took place in Italy a lot, and especially in Sweden. So what Europe we are speaking about? The referendum against the minaret construction, it took place in Sweden. So I said there is a new mapping of Europe from the perspective of Islam. It changes the mapping of Europe. Another one you know much better is cartoon controversy, came from Denmark. So the reconfiguration of the mapping of Europe is totally transformed in my mind when I'm working on Islam. So it's not the members of European Union that I'm speaking about. So it can be Switzerland, who is not a member, who thinks he's an outsider, but it entered into the European public sphere by this referendum. Good for them. So it set an example. Some countries are saying, oh, they have done what we wished. Some others would say, this is not an example to be followed, therefore forbidding the construction of mosques. For Muslims, this is very bizarre. How you differentiate, how you separate a minaret from a mosque. Again, I'm coming to the forms are important. Space matters, but forms matter as well. So how you separate a minaret from a mosque? Should a mosque have always a dome and a minaret? Nobody says that. But why this minaret, what does that mean, minaret being forbidden? The one, I will come to the circumcision one, which I like very much because, because it's very disturbing in many ways. But before that, naming and framing of the problems also is very interesting, and especially in relation to how we name the headscarf. It started as a affaire de foulard, headscarf affair in France. And then it shifted to veiling debate. And then it became total veiling and burqa. And then it became burkini. I think all these semantic shifts is very telling about this proximity and familiarization. People think that if they coin an Arabic or Persian word, they understand the meaning. Hijab, okay, I know about it. But burkini is a total new category. It's burqa and bikini. And you have seen this was the latest controversy in the beaches of Côte d'Azur, and the images you have maybe in your mind, how the policing of this woman with burkini, thinking that, is this not hygienic? What is this? What is this? Is this against gender equality? She's on the beach. That's quite an emancipatory activity in a way. So how we name these semantic shifts are also witnessing the difficulty of naming this phenomena and understanding in relation to us, always trying to other it. But burkini, you cannot, because it's totally new. It doesn't come from Saudi Arabia. It comes from Australia. It's a designer. Okay. And for the mosques, you have an example. Ground Zero Mosque in New York. It changed names. They said, Ground Zero Mosque, we don't want a mosque. This is a moral injury to the victims of 9/11. Then they changed it to Cordoba House. Cordoba House is the place of, from history, tolerance of 3 religions. No, we don't want any Cordoba House. And now it ended up with, I think, just housing, high-class housing. It ended the project. So Ground Zero Mosque is the same example. We should call it with an institute, cultural institute. So how we name, how we take off the religious meaning in the public sphere. So we have that deficit of framing these questions in intellectual terms. Neither multiculturalism holds. I didn't come into that because it was the fall of announcement that it's the end of multiculturalism. But religious minority rights doesn't hold neither, because each of these debates join societal debates, such as, like veiling, it becomes a question of gender equality and feminism. It confronts the secular norms of feminism. Halal food and ritual slaughtering, it becomes an issue of animal rights and not religious ritual. And now the latest one that I would like to say a word, because I think it's very important, because it brings in Jews, is the circumcision debate. And this remained quite unknown. I don't know if any one of you have heard of that. It remained only in Germany for the moment, and it is traveling. It traveled to Iceland. Iceland gave a proposition to forbid the circumcision of boys. But it is an irony of the irony of history, that Germany, who made such an important work coming to terms with its past, confronting the Holocaust past, they have forgotten that circumcision is a shared ritual, religious ritual between Muslims and Jews. There are differences. It's not the 8th day, but Sunnet and Brit Milah are very close as religious rituals. So they have forgotten. So they have said this is a moral, what they have said, this circumcision, as a bodily harm to a young boy's body. So again, this discourse of not religious minority right, but joining the societal debate, saying that this is about rights of the children. Then they have to decide their religion later, and they cannot shift back if they are circumcised. So this became a bodily harm that state should intervene. It's not a question between the father and the son, but then it becomes a matter of state. So they have decided, that became a court, and they made a law, and then, fortunately for Muslims, that Jews mobilized themselves, the Jewish community in Germany, saying this is outrageous, treat our religious traditions and rituals as backward, and they changed the law a little bit. So that shows how new issues, new controversies are arising and bringing in different actors in the public sphere. So the Jewish question, I think, is important at another level for European public sphere. I say it is the cursor between the encounter between Muslims and European countries. There has been all these debates of defining European identity as a Judeo-Christian identity. The hyphen is created after Holocaust. And there's big debates, identity of Europe. But there is also, as I say, these practices, religious rituals, bring the Jewish question as a Judeo-Islamic issue at the very daily life basis in relation to religious ritual slaughtering, halal and kosher, and in relation to circumcision. And when you go back in history, before Holocaust, you see before Judaism became a religion, quote unquote, this is the title of a very interesting book, that is Europeanized or becoming redefined on the basis of Protestant religion, all these issues about Judaism as a public religion was discussed. So ritual slaughtering and circumcision were among the debates that German society was facing at that time. So I think we have to bring in the Jewish question. Anyhow, it is already there today. But when I have written the book, the controversies were just starting. Last point, before I will show some images, is coming back to public sphere. Public sphere today is it in the making or unmaking? The question of, I think it will depend very much on the possibility of pluralism in the public sphere. it is more today about mixophobia than stranger sociability. That's a very shortcut, I said, because public sphere is the space of stranger sociability, to understand how we get familiarized with one each other before going to the politics. But it is becoming a place for, this is Zygmunt Bauman, who said mixophobia. And I think rather than using the word Islamophobia, I will use mixophobia. This is the boundary maintenance, no entry. So, and on the other hand, it's all procedural conceptions of public sphere. It is not a space for experimentation and exploration of dissensus, but on the contrary, it becomes procedural, how we can regulate behavior by laws and regulations. Unfortunately, this is how Habermas' concept of public sphere is understood, or mostly in terms of not the post-secular understanding, but how public sphere should be more procedural, how we come up with negotiation. What I'm trying to do here is first to open up to different really experiences, questions that are arised in the public sphere. It is to come back to Richard Bernstein's talk, it is politics of appearance. If there is no public sphere as sphere of appearance, this possibility to make yourself visible, then the politics, the domain of politics is very much reduced. So it is the place for acting, for familiarization with one another, and also maybe for new beginnings. I like that. Because all of these examples raise new issues to Muslims, to theologians who have never addressed these issues in European Islam, because Islam is becoming, for the first time maybe in history, a minority religion. They are experiencing their religion as a minority religion. So from Sharia law, they are inventing new halal lifestyles. I should end with that, halal lifestyles. I like it. And I would like to show some images to finish with, to see that if there can be more creative accommodations, not reasonable accommodations, but creative accommodations of difference. Reasonable accommodation of Charles Taylor is rather vertical, how the governments, modes of governments try to accommodate. What I mean by creative accommodation is through art in the public sphere, how these controversies emerge and how Muslims and non-Muslims deal with it. So first one is, can we see the first one? No, not mine. Well, in this man, second, therefore. Can I touch? Oh, here. Okay. This is a very well-known people, the Gilbert and George. They are these British gentlemen, a couple. You can see from their clothes. These are at the edge. And they have observed in their lifetime how the district in which they are living in London has changed from ethnical differences and now with Islamic presences. And you see how they are depicted, these new British Muslims. You don't know if they are men or women. But this collage, and this is a huge exhibition, but this one I think already is telling, this collage, they have put all the bombs. They look like bombs, but indeed they are drugs. This little, so they played with it. But this is to say this is explosive. And this collage, there is no interaction, there's no familiarization, but they share the same public sphere. They are on the streets, their neighborhood changed, but they don't know who they are, but they know that this is explosive and dangerous. Now, this one is by Mehdi Georges. He is mixed identity, I would say. He's from Belgium, French and Moroccan. And this is a way of dealing with the headscarf. And we always associate it with women, and we don't see the faces. But maybe when you put a man, you suddenly recognize there are faces, so he plays with it. And René Magritte. So it's very provocative in many ways. It is multi-way in both cases. It's not linear. And this one also requires, you need several codes to understand it. You cannot understand these works if you do not have several cultural codes. The first one as well, you have to know about British Muslims in the neighborhood and homosexual couple. This is also the first one. It's so interesting because this is the dangerous conjunctures of Islamic presence and secularized Europe. The second one is also about, you need several codes, theological understanding, because you have to know that, maybe most of you know that normally you don't even bring shoes into the mosque. So there is this effect of blasphemy, quote unquote, blasphemy in the sense of he juxtaposes what is purity and impurity. Normally shoes in the mosque is impure, it's not accepted. But when you put high heel red shoes and on the carpet, this is again a much more transgressive. And when you know the artist, this is also related with the intention of bringing sexuality into the question of Islam. But when you open this to interpretation, as I have done in my groups, people come up with very different interpretations. So many women said, well, this reminds us of the place of women in the mosques and in general in religion. So it depends how you interpret it. But this is also important. It's a relation to mosques, praying, and the place of women. This one is also now Muslims living in Europe. Nezaket İkici, well-known Turkish origin German, and the other one, Sarah Maple. Also, these are already artists having these double identities, and they are dealing with what is forbidden, what is, again, pure and impure. They are exaggerating. I think, who said there's only possibility, as like in arts, to exaggerate, to say something. And in the second one, Sarah Maple, it's almost like Christian figure. And in the case of Nezaket İkici, so this is the pig and the veil, and I had this in my groups, and someone came up, the Muslims said, well, okay, pig is not forbidden as an animal, it's only forbidden to eat. And so therefore there's no problem with that. But here, what she does, she's taking the pig in her hands as if she caresses, she takes Europe in her hands. I wanted to take this as a cover of my book, but this would have been misunderstood. This is very interesting because pig is something, this is totally, they're obsessed, but it's also used to intimidate Muslims for mosque constructions and what we eat in cafeterias. So halal is something very important in the European public sphere. So, and this was about circumcision. And I like this one because this was the Jewish museum in Berlin. I'm sorry for the others are more artistic, but this is not my fault. And this was just after Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I was there with a group of people from Jerusalem, and we went to speak about circumcision and the Jewish and Muslim perspectives on Europe. Why this is very, for me, important is Jewish Museum, after this controversy that I mentioned, made this exhibition. And making this exhibition, they therefore transformed that debate. This is a creative accommodation, all of these. And they invited Muslims living in Berlin. Maybe this was the first time they came to the Jewish Museum of Berlin. And we were there talking. And this exhibition brought Muslim, Jewish, and Christian. Christian, it had only one tableau because it is a different kind of circumcision. And many Muslims didn't know that the rituals, the similarity of rituals or the differences with Jewish. So this was a familiarization as well. But I find this a very important moment of opening up a space again and a kind of creative accommodation rather than reinforcing the the controversies as it's always framed: tolerance on the one hand, freedom of expression on the other, or rights discourse on the one hand, and religious fanaticism on the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
I'm going to quote you back to you. You said in your work you like to save public space from the media. And I was just hoping you could say a bit more about that. I think of the media as in some ways amplifying or constricting particular voices, which may open or close public space. So I was wondering how you're thinking about the relationship between the two. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two things, because public media became so determinate, and it has a different setting of debate. It solicitates scandals and binary oppositions. For instance, in the case of Veil, if you have the most radical position, you will be on the media. It's a shocking effect visually, especially visual media. Whereas you don't have the plurality of points of view in the public sphere. That's why I said I am speaking under the protection of Arendt and Bernstein, because public sphere requires plurality. Media is not pluralistic. It is, and there's no time and space for reflexivity. You receive something and you react to it. For instance, all these pictures I have shown you, I shared in my group, experimental public. Some of them I was scared. And then they came up with these reflexivities that nobody finds time in the public sphere. On television, you have to react to it. And always it's moral injury, blasphemy, and freedom of expression. This is always this way it is framed. It's only in real public sphere you can go beyond that. And that's why there's a big difference between media and media coverage, the way media has a structure of debate, and whereas the real life situation like this one requires patience, reflexivity, exchange, and it is not just blueprint. So it is a totally different one. So my research became almost like, I realized that at the end, an alternative public space. And people asked me to come back, to continue with that, because people who never met together, whereas media has totally different. I was very surprised that people, let's say European natives, had difficulty to come to the group. They all go to the television. We debate Islam without Muslims, but in these groups, Muslims came all over these 20 cities. They all came and they stayed 4 hours of discussion. Those non-Muslims who came were already on the ground, working like altermondialists or interfaith dialogue, leftist Catholic, anti-Semite, Islamophobia, kind of Jewish organizations. They came, but not ordinary people. I have difficulties. So this has shown me it reversed what I have seen in the actual public sphere, which is media-dominated, and the one I have made. But I must say, people are obsessed by the way Islam is depicted in the media. So Muslims themselves were only looking to their own self through the media. And that's another problem. So they were so much under the influence or obsessed by their representations of Islam in the media, anger, and so on. They sometimes, in the group, they dismissed the people who were with them on the ground, in the neighborhood for the last 20 years. I remember an old Catholic left woman. She said, but I'm here, I'm with you, I'm working with you. Oh, okay, they were speaking to the media. So this is not only about the criticism of the media, but people who has lost their relationship to spaces of encounter in their own locality. So I went to these places where these controversies arise. So normally people should be there. No, they looked more to the media. That's why I think it's very important to reappropriate public sphere and take it away from media.
Thank you very much. I come from Greece, and listening to you, I realized that our situation is totally different from what you described, because, you know, in Greece, there is no true, yet, no true separation of state and church. I mean, it's not like France. So the thing is that, well, there are the refugees, but apart from the refugees, there are Muslims that are installed in Greece and in the Greek society, and in a sense, well, partly integrated. And actually, it's the church, which is very powerful in Greek society, that is against, for example, the construction of mosques, etc. And listening to you, I thought that for me, well, personally, not only for me, but, the thing is that you have, on the one side, a religion, the official, in a sense, religion, that is very obvious in the public sphere. For example, in Greece, you know, you have people passing in front of churches and doing their still. Personally, I don't share this. And it's a bit ambiguous how to position oneself in front of this situation, because you have the official religion, and then if one follows your logic, one would say that one has to defend another religion against the official religion. You know, you understand what I mean? For 3 or 4 years ago, there were some manifestations because a cop had insulted a migrant and the Quran, and there were manifestations, and anti-racist, anti-fascist movements supported. We were there, but at the same time we were very perplexed exactly for this reason, because we were saying, yes, but now are we defending a religion in a society which has not yet separated church from the state?
Yeah, I understand. I understand what you say. I can even extend your argument to Europe, other countries, and say one of the reasons why secular feminists were so combative, so opponent, so aggressive in relation to the veiling issue, because they said we got autonomized, we got liberated from the power of the church almost very recently. That is, you know, the feminist movement of post-68, contraception and abortion rights mobilizations, this third wave secularization is very much related with being against the church in the private lives. So this memory of the French and German and other feminists living in Europe, seeing, and homosexuals also, seeing Muslims coming back, and they had the feeling, seeing Muslims living in Europe, they had the feeling now that they are going backwards and some of their rights will be taken. So this is in the psyche. It is very important. I do agree. This is one of the layers that makes it complicated, why it is so hard, why it is not only the category of race and even religion. And there's something, is it about religion? Is it about culture? And so that's why all these issues join the societal issues, because gender equality was based upon being against religion and against the church. So this makes it complicated, but you're not defending only other religion. It is the presence of Muslim migrants, and there's no church. That's to make it calmer. But I understand the psyche, yes. But it is, in Poland, there are no Muslims, there are no Jews left, and it is still the most anti-Semite and Islamophobic country. So you don't need even real presence of Muslims to have all that. So in Greece, be careful, it can come as well.
Two at once. Please, David, go for it.
Oh,
No, I find this extraordinary, illuminating, and fascinating, but I have a question that might sound utterly naive, but has always perplexed me.
oh my God, coming.
No, the issue is this. Does your work illuminate why the contingency of a controversy, why a certain issue becomes controversial at a certain time? I mean, you talk about, you've given a wonderful typology of different kinds of controversy, but I've always been mystified why something becomes controversial at a particular point in relationship to Muslims.
I have no idea.
Ah.
This is the spontaneity. It is spontaneous. It is exactly what you say. It became contentious. You don't know when and why. There are things, now this is the sociologist, when, how it started the Arab Spring, the immolation, we call it immolation of the young Tunisian guy. There has been several others which didn't trigger. There's a tipping point, triggering element. We don't know. It is not organizational. There is some element of unexpected element. Why these two young girls in 1989, they were just going to the high school and they are rejected from the high school because they were having this headscarf issue, 1989. Same moment, it was the fatwa against Salman Rushdie in Britain. We didn't make the relationship. We thought these were two totally separate events. Now I'm trying to make that these are related issues. But why, at the moment, there's this element? In the case, there's always an event. That's why I go to the place, event. A triggering event is this two girls. That's event. But then event makes it événementiel. That is the interesting thing. And then it becomes historical and sociological interest. But the event itself we cannot know, like the circumcision one. This was just one event of a young boy who had this circumcision practice, but he had some complications that the parents had to take him to the hospital. I'm sure this is not the first time it happens. And then it became a societal debate and then a court legislated. I don't know.
You give a very Orentian answer.
Yeah, you see, thank you, I passed the thesis.
Thank you for this very illuminating talk about the public sphere issues, and I see that pluralism plays a very important role in your arguments.
What is?
Pluralism.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned at the beginning the pluralism within Islam. And I wonder to what extent, when we look into the future, this pluralism can be retained within Islam. If we see a danger of losing this, is there a tendency towards homogenization within Islam? When I look at the developments in my country, Turkey, I see a tendency towards losing this pluralism. Of course, it has many historical origins, but when we go back to the Cold World War, it begins with the instrumentalization of Islam by the US and Israel against the left potential in the region. This had played a homogenizing effect within different religious practices. The Turkish state itself plays an active role in Europe with its public servants in enforcing endorsing a certain kind of Islam. So the financed organizations playing a role. And you mentioned how the new generation of Muslims are relearning their religion. This also strengthens maybe the tendency to homogenize the Islamic sphere. I wonder your thoughts about this.
Thank you very much. This is a very relevant, this is a very important point. And first, let me respond by something more peripheral, and I'll come later to what you ask more directly, is Edgar Morin, a French philosopher, said there are lives in religions. Sometimes religions become institutionalized, they are sleeping, they are dying, and there are moments of their lives it becomes fervent, it becomes passionate and zealous. And I think Islam entered into that zone of fervor. It's a zone of fervor, and there are many interpretations and claims on redefining, reshaping Islam, and this goes very much, as you mentioned, hand in hand with uniformization, what Islam should be. Because traditional Islam, we have made distinctions between Sufi Islam and then the learned Islam, the more Sharia Islam. But all these, or Shia and Sunni traditions, all these distinctions are disappearing, becoming more blurred. There is more this definition of Islam more in an assertive way, political way, but the differences between Iranian revolution, but also the jihadist movements, they are all trying to reinterpret, give a new shape to Islam in the modern world. So I do agree that there is what is the plurality within Muslims. So that's why Europe for me is a very important chance. As I finished very quickly saying, because there is no possibility of state. And I think Muslims have not thought about relationship to state enough. That's why in Turkey we are agonizing. Because they think they should own the state. All this political theory of distancing yourself with the state didn't take place. They were against the state because they were against the secular state. But they didn't think how they should behave when they come to power with other Muslim groups and with non-Muslims. There is no intellectual political thought about it. There is one book which is written by Olivier Roy who said the failure of the political Islam. That's what he was trying to say. They don't know how to think about ruling in Islam. Although there is velayet-i faqih, there's this new way of political authority, still he would argue yes or no. But there is this nation state and uniformization of Islam under the national state. So what about European Islam? That is the question. And when you cannot think in terms of state power, Sharia law. When you don't have Sharia law, then you go to halal lifestyles. And it is pluralistic by definition. But this will be a new era for Muslims to question. It starts with mosques. What kind of mosques you create? What is the language of sermon? Will it be in Arabic? This changed the whole discussion in the real life. Because normally it was always in Arabic. Islam is always considered the link to the Arabic language, natural. Iranians and Turks, they are the Indonesians, they are not the good Muslims because they don't have that natural language. Now, Turks always had this inferiority complex in relation to Arabic language. And now in Europe, they bring in Turkish language in mosques, not Arabic, because they have to relearn Turkish in context of migration. So the language, would that be shared language? Will it be French, German, English? Whose mosque this would be? Will it be only a mosque of British Muslims coming from Pakistan, and in the case of Germany, only Turks, in the case of France, Moroccans? I think these are all real questions. So plurality will be asked in different ways, not Shia, Sunni, but on the basis of what kind of mosque and what kind of language, and will it be a group of people? And all these issues are related with pluralism. But I understand your question, but I think you should ask differently the question of European Islam. This is a chance for Muslims. I know that they speak about new cosmopolitanism among Muslims. They have never met other Muslims that much in their own countries. Even ways of praying, they learn from each other in a way. So there's a different kind of pluralism today as experienced in Europe for Muslims. But that trend politically exists, and it's coming from outside. That's why European governments, they try to have new modes of governance that cut off with the countries of origin. And this is a very important next step is theologians. And theologians, again, the words are important because it started with imams. They said, we have to have our own imams, because if imams are coming from countries of origins, that is Morocco, Turkey, whatever, Algeria, first they don't know all these issues of young generations, they don't know the language, so they cannot address the issues that people are related with, first of all, and secondly, they can bring radicalism and so on. So they said we have to have new programs to have our own imams. And the imams now are transformed in the European context by the young generation to theologians. But they come also from Morocco, Turkey, Egypt, Al-Azhar, and so on. So these are all very transnational issues, and the plurality will be, I think, addressed in a different way. Because when they ask about theologians, I know this, a lot of work on young theologians. This is France-born, Italy-born Muslims having this theological education. The issues that they raise is already in relation to Judaism and Christianity. They try to understand their own religion in relation to other religions. That's also plurality.
I was wondering about the Jewish question. I cannot forget Karl Lagerfeld's statement regarding that. He said that one cannot kill millions of Jews just in order to replace them with their most terrible enemies, meaning Muslims. And I found this statement very telling, especially regarding the public sphere in Europe. Because what he said explicitly was that we don't find Jews as a problem as it used to be in the past because we just exterminated them and the rest went to Israel, so that's not an issue. And now there is a new there is a new presence that we cannot really support. I found it also, this terrible statement, very interesting, especially because of the whitening of Jews in Europe. To a certain extent, Jews stopped being the other. In France, we can see it very clearly. And in the same time, there is also Israel's statements and perception of itself as part of Europe, as a Western country. And I was wondering what do you think of all this complexity of we cleaned the public sphere, but now, and at the same time, anti-Semitism includes us both. So, despite the fact that in Israel, for instance, they talk about anti-Semitism as something that doesn't have to do with Semites, only with Jews. So I was just wondering.
This reminds me of of Gilles Anidjar's book on Arab Jew. So, and this is very related with Western secular modernity. So good Jew is the one who is separated from the Arabic origins. So, and this is what is taking place in today's European public sphere. I try to do just the contrary. There is this Judeo-Christian identity of Europe from above, discussed. And I'm trying to say, in spite of the will of Jews, they are also taken into these controversies that show the proximity of lived religion, religious rituals with Muslims, that is ritual slaughtering and circumcision debate. So they have to be with. And then there is the terrorist attacks. I mean, it is not the Bataclan attacks, Charlie Hebdo attacks, it was also related with kosher supermarket. We cannot forget that. It is important. So is this a lateral dominance? So there is this cursor of Jew is at the heart of it, I think. There was a very late petition in France, which is a very disturbing petition of hundreds of intellectuals, condemning anti-Semitism of Muslims. For me, it's so it is almost like only Muslims are anti-Semite. Yeah. And it is exactly these grounds. I don't have a shortcut answer, but it is, I think the Jewish question is at the heart of it. I have put in my a chapter in my book, The Jewish Cursor, and they said, you don't need that? What is this? Because they want Islam to be only about Muslims. Already I have brought non-Muslims, and now I'm bringing Jews. And then all these issues started to come up. You know, thank you for sociological imagination. That's what I'm saying to my students. Sometimes things that you do not observe, you have to bring in from your own mind. And I thought this Jewish question was going to be very decisive, and it is getting more and more decisive. And it's important for Muslims, and that I have learned from the German writers, Turkish writers. They were the first who has told me that they cannot be citizens of Europe if they do not learn about the Holocaust. They do not come to terms with the Holocaust in Germany. And this was a very powerful point. That's how I have joined an association, a foundation who was against the negation of Holocaust, a Latin project, because I said, this is a condition for Muslims to be part of Europe is to know about Holocaust. They cannot de-responsibilize themselves. They cannot say, we're not interested, we're not responsible. If they are living in Europe, they have to come to terms in different ways, the way I say. And Jews has to come also into the present day controversies. So I think these co-citizenship is important. It's not only from the vertically imposed, but among NGOs and kind of consciousness that Muslims and Jews have to develop together.
I feel like we've just started and just getting going, but unfortunately we just can't stay in this space any longer. So thank you so much, Nilüfer, for really wonderful
Thank you.
talk.